Hello? Okay, that's not what I want. Do you see a folder or a file that says real estate broker section, the top property address 607 Newcastle? You don't. It is. I just need, I'll take a look. Same thing, John? Strange. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Is my voice coming through clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mark, a replay of the meeting will be made available. As a matter of fact, it's being recorded currently. So if you have anything you'd like to add right now, it'll be recorded. So John, how'd the listing appointment go yesterday?
It went really well. They are such a cute older couple, and they have a cute place. So we're going to probably sign the listing contract today.
Oh, very nice. And where's that located?
It is in the Desert Princess, which is one of the few communities that does allow short-term rentals. And we'll probably go on the market somewhere around $350 for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, fully furnished. It is on leased land, so the lease is like $135 a month. So that's not bad.
That's not.
HOA is $710, but does
Oh.
include a lot. And they actually already have it rented for the month of, I think, November, December, January, February, and March.
Well, that makes the pain a little bit easier.
Yeah. So
Is there a lifespan on the land lease?
yes, all land leases have expirations. And I'm waiting to check on this because it's very few people that handle land leases down here, and some are private leases, some are Indian leases. Most of these expire like in 2069. The farthest I've seen them out is to like 2077. This will probably be the first land lease that I'm representing a seller on.
Now, where you're living, it's not leased land or
No, but I'll lease it out if you find me another place down here that I like. They're actually just on the other side of the wash from me, so it's very convenient.
That is nice.
Yeah, they have 3 9-hole championship golf courses, like 38 pools, loads and loads of tennis and pickleball courts, health and fitness center, hotel on the property, great restaurant. So it's a nice resort.
Sounds nice. Yeah.
And the allowing short-term rental is a big plus out here.
I would think so too. Are short-term rentals permitted in your neighborhood?
Nope, 30-day or less. But it's interesting because we're going to have probably a lawsuit pretty soon. The declarant for the properties that were still not built sold off all the extra land to SunCal, which I think is an Irvine-based company. And they want to build 52 build-to-rent properties that are pretty much adjacent to almost where my home is. And everybody's up in arms because nobody was talked to about it. And nobody wants, a rental community in here. with the homes, with the prices of the homes here. And Toll Brothers said they would have never sold homes here if they knew that there was a community that they were going to be building build to rent homes. So it'll be interesting. It'll be the first of its kind in the valley. So they're getting a lot of they're going to get a lot of publicity about it.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's certainly good to see you. Anything about the marketplace you'd like to share with the rest of us today? Anybody? I don't see anybody in the chat box. There's one little bit of laughter at least. Well, okay. So today's discussion, how a seller may cancel a purchase agreement. It's not just simply about canceling a purchase contract, but I think it's also understanding timeframes, acceptance dates, what is deemed to be valid acceptance. So that's all critical in the discussion. So a couple of things we're going to answer today. For example, what are the reasons a seller may cancel as stated in the RPA? What's the procedure for canceling? Does the seller have to complete repairs before giving a notice to perform? How do you prove personal receipt? What does the seller or listing agent do when the buyer refuses to sign escrow cancellation instructions after the seller has properly issued a cancellation and the seller would like to sell to a subsequent buyer? It's questions that always come up. Any initial thoughts on that before I continue? So what's the most important consideration for any seller when canceling a contract? Be sure it's done properly. We see multiple cancellation forms that are not properly completed or only partially completed. And something in that manner could be contested. I understand everybody's impatient, especially sellers, but let's make sure that we do it properly. So the RPA prescribes exactly 10 reasons why a seller can cancel. All of the reasons require some type of notice be given to the buyer before cancellation. And that's either a notice to perform or demand to close. So those 10 reasons are: remove the applicable contingencies, the buyer fails to deposit the earnest money into escrow, the funds for the earnest money deposits are not good when deposited, hard to believe that occurs. The buyer fails to deliver the pre-qualification letter, the buyer fails to deliver verification of down payment and closing costs, or the seller has reasonably disapproved of the verifications. Now, the reason the buyer fails to return the TDS, NHD, and lead disclosures, and that's a requirement of the contract that the buyer return those disclosures in a stipulated time frame. They don't, the seller can cancel. The buyer fails to sign a separate liquidated damages form for an increased deposit, or the buyer fails to deliver notice of FHA or VA costs or terms. We don't see very many FHA and VA loans. But the final reason for the seller to cancel is when the buyer does not close escrow, and we would use a demand to close escrow. The cancellation provisions of the contract are all found under paragraph 14 of the RPA. Now, those are the reasons that the contract gives us, but there are many other reasons. For example, things that could be written into the contract would include a short sale addendum, for example, or contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. So those are other cancellation rights that could be included in the agreement. And of course, there's other reasons: fraud, mistake, duress, and if there is a lack of meeting of the minds. But keep in mind, if the seller wants to cancel on a basis that's not explicitly stated in the contract, it is always suggested that they speak with their own attorney before proceeding. So an overview of the steps to cancel. Check the time frames to see if the buyer has performed as required by the contract. Make sure the seller has fulfilled all seller obligations. The notice to buyer perform or demand to close escrow must be filled out properly, indicating what the buyer has failed to do, and it must be delivered and personally received by the buyer or the buyer's agent. Delivery is important. Next step, upon delivery, we have to count the days before we cancel. And then determining the day after the last day to perform. That's when the seller may sign the cancellation using form cancellation contract. So let's just go into some of the details of those steps. Checking the time frames. So the very first step in checking the time frame is to figure out when acceptance of the contract occurred. And that's got a very particular meaning in the RPA. So it's the day when the offer is accepted in writing and then delivered back personally to the other party or the agent for the other party. And that's dependent upon whether or not the agent's contact information is completed on page 16 of the RPA. So if we look at what I have for you on the screen, under the real estate broker section, if this information is completed under section 5, then personal delivery can be valid if sent to the agent whose name is on here. We'll talk about the designated email address also. And personal receipt is by delivering back to the agent whose name is listed here. It could be in the form of a link that you send with the contracts attached. It could be the actual documentation itself. Another form of delivery would be to the designated electronic delivery address. This simplifies the whole process for anyone who's involved in regards to delivering any documents associated with the transaction. So if we do complete the designated electronic delivery address and documentation is sent there, it's deemed to be received. So it certainly simplifies your life. If I'm a listing agent, I would want a buyer's agent to include that contact information in the designated electronic delivery address field. So now let's talk about date of acceptance. So remember, if assuming a buyer makes an offer on Monday, the seller signs an acceptance of that offer on Tuesday, but it's not delivered back to the buyer's agent until Wednesday, the date of acceptance is Wednesday. And if the date of acceptance is Wednesday, that is day 0 when counting. The next day after acceptance, Thursday, is day 1, for example. So in counting the days, as stated, the date of acceptance is day 0. The next day is 1. Days means calendar days, unless otherwise specified. So that means you count every day, including Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. However, the last day for performance cannot be a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. So in that case, the last day is the next business day. All the time periods in the RPA are counted in that manner. The one exception is placing the earnest money deposit in the escrow. And in that case, we count business days only. So checking the buyer's compliance day. So after determining the acceptance date and counting the days accordingly, we need to check the provision of the contract that the seller is relying on in demanding the buyer's performance. So let's say, for example, if the seller is demanding that the buyer remove the inspection contingency, then the buyer must be given at least 17 days thereafter to remove the inspection contingency. So remember, if day 17 falls on Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, then the seller cannot demand performance before or on the last day. And a notice to perform can be delivered no earlier than 2 days before the expiration of the applicable time frame. And when delivering the notice to perform, it is based upon the 17 days, not the fact that the seller has or the buyer has until the following business day to perform. So most contingencies are removed in 17 days. That includes the inspection contingency, and these are all default timeframes once again. Appraisal contingency and return for certain statutory disclosures. For example, the buyer returned the TDS and the NHD and lead disclosures. Why do we make sure that the buyer returns those? Because we have no idea otherwise if the buyer has received those disclosures. So all it does is provide validation that those disclosures were delivered and received. So other deadlines, 17 days for loan contingencies, 3 days for the buyer to deliver verification, down payment, closing costs, 3 days for the buyer to deliver a pre-qualification letter, 3 business days to place earnest money into deposit, and an additional 5 days to remove contingencies after delivery of any report, disclosure, or information which the seller is responsible for providing. We'll talk about that 5 days when it's invoked, if at all. So those are default timeframes. And remember, the contract specifies that a notice to perform cannot be delivered any earlier than 2 days before the expiration of the buyer's time. So it's on day 17, we can deliver a notice to perform no sooner than day 15. So of course, before we cancel, we have to make sure that the seller has completed the seller's obligations, and the seller should be in full compliance of all of their obligations at the time the notice to perform is delivered. So what does that mean? Did the seller deliver all of their disclosures? You can't demand that a buyer remove contingencies if the seller has not complied with their contractual obligation of delivery of all documents as defined within the contract. Now, we talked about the contingency period for the most part, 17 days for most contingencies. And the seller has a requirement to deliver all seller disclosures during the initial 7 days following acceptance. If the seller does deliver those disclosures, the buyer's contingency is going to be the greater of 17 days, or whatever stipulated in the contract. But if the seller delivers the seller's disclosures on day 15, then the buyer has an additional 5 days to remove those contingencies. I think where it becomes a real issue, we see, and it's changing now, but in many cases, offers include very short contingency periods, and that's just a matter of attracting the seller to choosing their offer. But let's say we say a 10-day contingency period, and the seller disclosures are delivered on day 5. Well, the buyer has to remove those contingencies within the 10 days. If the seller disclosures are delivered on day 8, the buyer then has until the 13th day to remove disclosures. Remember, if the seller doesn't perform within a specified time frame, the buyer gets an additional 5 days upon delivery of those disclosures thereafter. Other questions that come up: did the seller allow the buyer to conduct investigations? Sometimes sellers don't want to do that, or they claim I'm selling the property as is. If the seller prevents the buyer from performing investigations that they have reasonably requested, then once again, the seller cannot demand that the buyer remove their contingencies based upon the lack of the seller's compliance. Another question that comes up also: does the seller have to complete repairs before giving a notice to buyer to perform? Seller has no obligation to complete repairs before demanding the buyer remove their contingencies. The seller's obligation is to complete those repairs prior to the final walkthrough. That is the time frame. And what I would suggest when representing a seller, I wouldn't have them complete repairs until after contingencies are removed. If you can avoid doing it until then, they get angry if they've spent money. And then filling out the forms. So something critical: the notice for form must be correctly filled out, indicating what the buyer has failed to do. Can a contingency removal form be used without a notice to buyer to perform? So a common mistake that occurs is simply when an agent merely sends over a contingency removal form and demands that it be signed or returned. But the CR, the contingency removal form, is not a demand, does not qualify as a notice to buyer to perform. So you must use the notice to buyer to perform to start the clock ticking, and use that form only that's stated in the contract itself. So how should the notice be completed? Well, let's check the boxes. So if we look at a notice to perform, I'll pull that up. We would check the applicable boxes under section I or II, is it I or 2, Roman numeral 2, indicating which contingencies are to be removed. Now, if we go down to the lower portion of the form, in bold print, it says, buyer, if you do not remove the specified contingencies and take the specified contractual actions indicated above within 2 days, that's the default time frame. Well, I see people sometimes writing in 48 hours or 1 day. If you didn't change the time frame in the contract, it is 2 full days following delivery and receipt of the notice to perform. So what does that mean? That means if at any time of the day I delivered a notice to perform to the buyer, if I did it on Monday, they have until Thursday to remove the contingency. If you change it to 48 hours, you change it to 1 day, and it's not in conformance with the contract, then I would say that the notice to perform would probably be considered defective, and you'd have to start all over again. So let's not put ourselves in that position. And then going back to receipt, delivery and receipt, remember, if the agent's name is included under the real estate broker section, delivery to that agent is deemed to be personal delivery to the buyer. If the agent's name is not in there, then delivery must be made to the buyer themselves for it to be valid service. And then delivery of the forms. Well, the contract is very broad in that regard. So delivery of the forms or notices, email, mail, messenger, fax, or otherwise. So delivery almost doesn't matter. But you should be using the same delivery method that you did for any and all documents preceding delivery of the notice to perform. Now, obviously, if you have the designated electronic delivery address completed, it simplifies the whole procedure for you because it's deemed to be received when sending it to that address. Now, a lot of times we may not have the designated email address or electronic delivery address, and then we've sent the notice to perform to the buyer's agent. And how do we acknowledge receipt? Well, a lot of times they'll call because they're angry and they received the notice to perform, they feel like they were blindsided. Also, maybe they'll just send you an email acknowledging it. That's great. We need to have some kind of evidence that the agent did indeed receive the notice to perform. And it could be any possible methodology, text, so on and so forth. Then, of course, the third possibility would be if you're having discussion because the buyer's agent has not responded, then you can take contemporaneous notes, and it should be indicating the date, time, the discussion. So that would be useful in itself to validate or prove that delivery did occur. Then, of course, a lot of times buyers agents go completely silent and you don't know if they've received anything, even though you're using the same email address you have used all along. So what do we want to do? We probably want to send it under various methods and different times also. It's going to be hard for them to refute that they didn't receive those documents if you made the effort to deliver it in various forms or methods. So now, counting the days, how do you determine what day cancellation may be issued? Well, once we've established that the notice to perform was personally received, and ideally the date of delivery and personally receiving that document is the same, then the day of personal receipt is day 0. And it doesn't matter what time of day that was received. Remember that. And once again, if day 2 falls on Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, the obligation to perform falls on the following business day, and they have until 11:59 p.m. that night to perform. The seller could not cancel until the following day. The cancellation form, let's pull that up. It's critical that we complete this properly. That's one thing I must say. When we look in section 1, cancellation of contract, directly beneath that, there are 3 boxes. One's for buyer, one's for seller, and both buyer and seller. If the seller is going to be checked or unilaterally canceling the contract based upon the reasons noted below, check the box seller. If you check it buyer, or you check it both buyer and seller, and only the seller signs, then it's highly likely that one could contest the validity of the cancellation. So completing it properly is critical. And then remember, we would check the appropriate box there under section 1A, B, so on and so forth, whatever is applicable. And what takes place if the seller now is prepared on today? Let's say the seller has given notice to perform and the buyer had through 11:59 p.m. last night to perform and hasn't yet. Now the seller wants to move forward with canceling the contract unilaterally. So in the event the buyer removes the contingencies before the cancellation form is sent to the buyer, the seller cannot cancel any longer. So if the buyer complies before the seller sends it, then the seller has no right to cancel the contract. A couple of other things, if we go back to the cancellation form, there are two parts to this form. Section 1, cancellation of contract, and Section 2, release of deposit and cancellation of escrow, two separate aspects of every transaction. So the question becomes, is cancellation effective if a buyer will not sign cancellation of escrow? Well, the buyer can hold the seller hostage. However, it could bring into question whether or not the cancellation was valid. So we do want all parties to sign this. There's no question about that. Now, what takes place if the seller cancels pursuant to a notice to buyer to perform? May the seller retain the buyer's deposit? And the answer is no. So whenever a seller cancels using a notice to perform for any of the 9 stated reasons, and that includes closing on time, and those reasons exclude the service of the demand to close escrow, then the RPA requires the seller return the buyer's deposit. And I think we find that in section 14 of the purchase contract. So when your sellers make a demand to keep the money, well, the contract has certain stipulations forcing or demanding the return of those funds to the buyer. So it's under 14C2. I just want you to see this. So this is in regards to seller right to cancel, section 14C2. But the very last sentence, so should the seller cancel in such event, seller shall authorize or return the buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by buyer and other expenses already paid by escrow holder pursuant to this agreement prior to seller's cancellation. So it's telling all parties that if the seller cancels based upon delivery notice to perform, because the buyer hasn't removed contingencies, the seller cancels, the seller has an obligation to return the deposit less fees and costs. Any questions on that? Okay. Is canceling the contract the same as canceling the escrow? No. The RPA permits the seller to cancel unilaterally for various reasons. However, cancellation of the escrow requires a mutual agreement in writing for both buyer and seller. So in the absence of mutual cancellation, the escrow may still be considered open, and there may be questions as to whether the contract has been properly terminated. So the fact that an open escrow by itself does not mean the initial buyer has retained rights to buy. It just suggests that it's possible that there may be a flaw in regards to the cancellation. So what do we do when a buyer refuses to sign escrow cancellation instructions after the seller has properly issued a cancellation? Well, that can cause problems. As a matter of fact, an escrow company may refuse to close while there's an unresolved first escrow on the same property. Also, title companies may provide title insurance or may not provide title insurance without an exclusion. So we need to place them on notice. So it's always appropriate for us to advise the seller to accept a second offer subject to cancellation of prior escrow. Mary, are you on with this still?
Oops. Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Mary. So we make it a practice, I know, in terms of notifying title if there is an open escrow, because we don't want any exclusions from coverage associated with the title insurer. Is that something that an underwriter is concerned about in any transaction in which they've experienced a cancellation? I assume if you've got an open title order with one person and then we've changed the names, then it's going to put you on notice.
That's correct. And it's actually alarming the number of people that don't take the measures that your office takes. Sometimes we'll have to ask for it to see if there is anything, because we've become aware that, there's a complete new buyer and they gave us no underlying documentation for backup.
So what will you request in that case?
We will ask them for proof that it has been canceled.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, unless we're going to write an exclusion in.
Yes,
So
so you will write in exclusions.
Correct. If we are made aware of it, they will put that in.
Okay, so that means a potential the subsequent buyer may not have coverage in the event there's a claim, or no one's going to have any coverage, as a matter of fact, in the event there's a claim from the initial buyer.
That's right. And I mean, really, then that means you're paying for title insurance for
For
nothing.
nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if a seller is wanting to go forward with a second buyer, even though the initial buyer has refused to cancel the escrow, we need to tell them to seek the assistance of an attorney. And then in addition to that, we're going to be sure that we include a disclosure with the second buyer, making them fully aware that there is an open escrow. We don't need to give them the details, but we can just say something to the effect that the party entitled to funds is not receipt of those funds. But we need to put them on notice. We need to also notify title. Now, when we've notified lawyers title, to the best of my knowledge, they have never created an accept or exclusion or exception on the prelim, but we put them on notice, and we have escrow also amend the escrow instructions in addition to us issuing an addendum. So that's very important. And then also sometimes clients want to put a lot of burden on us, and there is a CAR form that does address this. Let's assume the initial transaction was canceled by the seller. There's an unresolved escrow with that initial transaction, and the seller now wants to move on to the next buyer. Well, CAR does have a form, and it's under the CAR sample letters, and it's entitled Receipt of Subsequent Offer. And there's a couple of really interesting aspects in here that just validate everything we're talking about today. And if we were to look at section 2, about the middle, it says, in the absence of mutual cancellation instructions, the escrow regarding the above agreement may still be considered open, and there may be a question as to whether that agreement has been properly terminated. So that puts them on notice. We want them to be fully aware as we move forward also. Under section 3, it indicates that under the Realtor Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, realtors shall recommend that sellers' landlords obtain the advice of legal counsel prior to acceptance of a subsequent offer, except when the acceptance is contingent upon or contingent on the termination of the pre-existing purchase contract or lease. So your ethical obligation, it would be a breach if you don't do this, if the seller wants to move forward and the seller does not want a contingency stating that it's based upon the cancellation of the prior escrow, then you need to put them on notice and let them know they do need to seek the assistance of an attorney. All very important for us in terms of risk management. And then section 4, and here it is, opening a second escrow and your obligation to disclose. Please note that the current escrow company will likely not permit a closing on a subsequent sale without a mutual cancellation of the escrow with the first buyer. If you choose to open escrow with a different escrow for the subsequent sale, it's necessary to disclose to the subsequent buyer that there's an outstanding escrow for that property. So we just need to follow the guidelines, and we'll protect ourselves and everybody else involved in the transaction. Any questions about that? MLS statuses. Now, if before the contract is canceled, can you change the status, at least according to the guidelines, to active? No, you can't. It's a violation, although I have told people I wouldn't wait. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. Now, if you do change the status to active and there is an open escrow, the seller's canceled the contract, but there's an open escrow, you have an obligation to disclose that in the private remarks. So don't get confused with the contract and escrow, by the way, when you're disclosing that information. So CRMLS permits us to actively market the property, even though the escrow has not been resolved. Question? And Ruth, yes, the buyer would many times sign escrow instructions if it meant getting their deposit back. I agree with you. We've had circumstances in which the buyer has refused to take their money back, as they believe that they have a valid right still to pursue the purchase of that property. So yeah, you would think reasonably that's what's going to happen, but it all depends upon the buyer and the buyer's approach to the situation. If they think the cancellation is defective and they're going to try to force a sale, they don't take their money back and they don't close the escrow. And then in terms of using a demand to close escrow, that document is to be used when either party cancels based upon the failure of the other to close. So before canceling, you must deliver a demand to close escrow. Now, the contract and the default time frame and the demand to close escrow is 3 days subsequent delivery. So once I deliver a demand to close escrow, then the buyer has 3 days to close. On the 4th day, the seller could cancel. And counting days for demand to close escrow is the same as any other time frame in the purchase contract. And then other interesting questions: should we always deliver?
Taking my little break, my 15 minutes. Oh my goodness.
I recognize that
Kind of
voice. I'm looking for her so I can mute her. Carmenza? Got her. Okay. Got her. What's interesting in terms of delivering a demand to close escrow each and every time, case law is inconsistent on the right of the seller to hold the buyer strictly to the close of escrow date. Isn't that interesting? Even where there's a time of the essence clause. So sometimes attorneys will advise sellers to not deliver the demand to close escrow any sooner than the day of the close of escrow. That would mean it's giving them 3 more days to close. And then anytime you deliver the demand to close escrow, you can't accelerate the time frame. You can only give them more time. So you can't say close in 2 days. Don't try to change the terms of the contract but via delivery of a demand to close escrow. And then what if a seller uses a notice of perform to cancel a contract? Is that an effective cancellation? Most likely, yes. Could it be contested? Possibly, yes, because the contract demands that you use a demand to close escrow. But also remember, I specifically showed you language in the purchase contract that states, subsequent to delivery of a notice to buyer to perform, if the seller cancels, the seller shall return the buyer's deposit. So let's not get into any discussions about that by delivering the wrong document. And not only that, but it may prove to be defective in regards to the cancellation. And then retaining the deposit. Can a seller retain the deposit after canceling pursuant to a demand to close escrow? What's possible? Did the buyer remove all contingencies, for example? If the buyer hasn't removed all contingencies, highly likely that the seller is going to prevail and retain the deposit. If the buyer did remove all contingencies, most likely the seller is going to prevail in terms of pursuing and retaining the buyer's deposit. Do you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share? I have completed my presentation, as a matter of fact. No? Okay. I'm just checking to see if I have any other questions. I don't see any. Well, any questions for Mary, since Mary's on the line with us?
Everyone's so quiet today.
Yeah. Yep.
We must be in a haze from the shift in the market.
Sorry. Yeah, I had a question for Mary.
Hi, Carmenza.
Hey, I'm sorry. I apologize for it opens up. I had a question. When you return, let's say we have to cancel escrow, and the parties decide to don't bother with the money, so the seller will give the full amount of the money to the buyer. Is that okay if they can retain some costs that they already went to it, like maybe some when they print out the association and they already spent some money, or you have to do some kind of document to use it for the next buyer. In
Would you
order
like me to address that, Mary?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, in that case, Carmenza, the contract is going to dictate who bears the burden of the cost. So HOA docs, that's a good example. Regardless of the fact that the buyer's loan is canceled, if it is a seller expense as defined in the contract, the seller has no right to try to retain any costs out of the buyer's deposit. Now, you might try to leverage releasing that, but contractually, the seller has no right to retain any of those monies. They can, or what can be withheld from the buyer's deposit would be any buyer direct expenses that they incurred.
Okay,
Yeah.
so in the point of view of the title company, in order to reopen a new escrow, who's gonna give you like they already pay or no pay, or how we get that?
Well,
That
I
wouldn't
think
necessarily, it would more be escrow, right? That
it would be escrow. That would be an aspect escrow is involved in. Title would have no role in it at all. As
Okay.
a matter of fact,
Yeah.
at that point in
Okay.
time.
Sure.
So it'd just be a matter of working between the parties, which really are the agents, and just directing escrow what to do. Nothing more than that, in my opinion.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Carmenza, thank you. Any other questions before we go? No? All right. Well, thank you for attending, everybody. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay,
And I
thank
hope
you.
you have a very nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.